Hello everyone, my name is Mellyna Putri Diniar and student number 33. I'd like to present the subchapter called Perspective and the Subjective and Objective Image. It is one of the subchapters on the representation and interaction, designing the position of the viewer material. Alright, without further ado, let me just start moving into the next slide. I'm just gonna slightly give you a brief introduction about this chapter, as the whole chapter is related to the representation and interaction, particularly on designing the position of the viewer. Alright, it is apparent that visual communication has resources for constituting and maintaining another kind of interaction, such as the interaction between the producer and the viewer of the image. Or even another way of saying this is that image, which includes any kinds of visual, involves two kind of participants. And the first one is represented participants. It is the people, the places, and things depicted in image. It's called the represented participants. And the second, we got interactive participant, which are the people who communicate with each other through images, and also the producers and as well the viewers of the image. And these 2 points right here has 3 kinds of relations, which are the first one, relations between represented participants, and then the relation between interactive and represented participant, and the last one is relation between the interactive participants. Next slide, we eventually reached the main purpose of this presentation, which is to explain the subchapter titled Perspective and the Subjective and Objective Image. Alright, so there is yet another way in which images bring about relation between represented participants and the viewer, called perspective. Producing an image involves the selection of an angle, a point of view, and this implies the possibility of expressing subjective attitudes towards represented participants, humans or even otherwise. By saying subjective attitudes, we do not mean that these attitudes are always individual and encoded as though they were subjective, individual, and unique. Next slide. We got the system of perspective, which realized attitude was developed in the Renaissance, a period in which individuality and subjectivity becomes important social values, and it developed precisely to allow image to become informed by subjective points of view. There are then, since Renaissance, 2 kinds of image in Western culture. The first one is subjective image. In subjective images, the viewer can see what there is to see only from a particular point of view. And we also have objective images. In objective image, the image reveals everything there is to know, or that the image produced has been judged to be so, about the represented participants, even if to do so it is necessary to violate the laws of naturalistic depiction or indeed the laws of nature. Next slide. Alright, so modern technical drawing may still show what we know about the participant they represent, what is objectively there rather than what we would see if we were looking at them in reality. Alright, now take a look at the figure 4.6. If we were in reality to see the front of the cube in figure 5.6, the way we know it objectively is a square, and we would not at the same time be able to see the top and the side. It is even an impossible picture, or a possible picture of a highly regular hexagon rather than a cube, from the point of view of what we can see in reality. Yet in many contexts, for instance, assembly instruction for a piece of furniture, an objective picture like this is entirely acceptable. Next slide, we have this subjective image. By contrast with the objective image, which disregards the viewer, the point of view of the subjective perspectival image has been selected for the viewer. As a result, there is a kind of symmetry between the way the image producer relates to the represented participants and the way the viewer must relate to them. The point of view is imposed not only on the represented participants but also on the viewer, and the viewer's subjectivity is therefore subjective in the original sense of the word. in the sense of being subjected to someone or something. The system of perspective is fundamentally naturalistic. It developed in a period in which the world of nature was no longer seen as manifesting a divine order, but as an autonomous and ultimately meaningless order whose law, legitimized by the authority of scientific observation and the physical laws of nature. In the late 19th century, after centuries of hegemony, both systems came into crisis. In the high arts, as well as the popular arts, films, for example, still use perspectival image, but in a near cubist fashion, provides multiple and constantly shifting viewpoints in its editing. On the other hand, modern magazines and websites lay out from another category of visual works, which are no longer based on solely on the compositional principle of perspective. Of course, they still contain many perspectival images, but these have been subordinated to a structure that can no longer be said to be perspectival. Two examples may illustrate this. Take a look at the picture of 4.7, the figure in Fort Mondero website. It is called naturalistic. What we observe here could also be observed in reality. There could be a car positioned in that way in front of this particular couple and this particular building. As a result of the angle and the social distance, it is called a low angle long shot, with a car in the foreground, viewers are made to relate to the represented participants in a certain way. They are made to look up to them, and they are made to see them as if they notice the car and the stylish couple from across the street with envy. Now, comparing this figure of 4.7, now in the picture of the Ford Fiesta page in 4.81, on the other hand, the viewer, rather than being positioned in the natural world, is now confronted with a world which openly presents itself as a semiotic construct, mixing perspectival and non-perspectival elements in such way as to give the appearance of a continuum of forms, the representational to the significational. While the visual as a whole remains non-naturalistic, the car on this page cannot be said to be behind the Las Vegas road sign or behind the word rock solid, in the way that the couple and the building in figure 4.7 can be said to be behind the Fort Mondeo. In front of and behind lose their ideational dimension and become textual principles only. The two pages thus exemplify a shift from the dominance of nature to the dominance of signification, and from the dominance of the perceptual to the dominance of the conceptual. Move into the next slide, we have now the objective image. Scientific and technical pictures such as diagrams, maps, and charts usually encode an objective attitude. This tends to be done in one of two ways, by a directly frontal or perpendicular top-down angle. To illustrate this with a simple example, when a cube is drawn perspectively, its sides are not of equal length, and the degree of distortion depends on the angle, or the encoded viewer position. The cube does not look as we know it is in reality, with all its sides of equal length, but as we see it from a particular position. But from directly in front, the third dimension disappears, and the cube appears flat, with all its sides of equal length. From above, exactly the same effect occurs. Perspective and its attitudinizing effect have been naturalized. However, not all diagrams, maps, and charts are completely objective. The vertical angle of the Gulf War map in the figure 4.19 is high but not completely top-down, and its horizontal angle is oblique, causing us to look at the theater of war from the sidelines in a relatively detached way. Frontal and top-down angles, however, are not objective in entirely the same way. Frontal angle is the angle of maximum involvement. It is oriented towards action, and it is also the angle of this is how it works, this is how you use it, and this is how you do it. Meanwhile, the top-down angle, on the other hand, is the angle of maximum power. It is oriented towards the theoretical objective knowledge. It contemplates the world from a godlike point of view, puts it at your feet rather than within reach of your hands. In all these examples, the angle is high, explicitly acknowledging the objective stance of the godlike. Meanwhile, the top-down view, and often narrativating it as the view from the satellite, that modern tool of the production of visual knowledge and symbol of informational power. Now take a look at the figure 4.20. It is called the horizontal angle. This angle may vary with the figure in the increase in tourism. We are directly involved in this kind of angle. Next slide. In this section, we add some notes on different less subjective kinds of perspective. Now we also have the figure of 4.21. The first figure on this picture is called a cube in a front view. The cube is seen from an oblique angle. One of these sides will come to the view, but the other side will remain hidden. And next, we have also the drawing 2 in a figure 4.21. On the other hand, is example of a frontal isometric perspective. Here, the front of the cube is not distorted, yet we can see the side and the top, and the horizontal parallels do not converge towards a vanishing point. Frontal isometric perspective is based on the objective dimension of the represented participants, on what we know these dimensions to be rather than on how they appear to us. For this reason, frontal isometric perspective is used in technical drawings, where it is important to be able to measure the dimension of the represented object from the drawings. In frontal isometric perspective, it is not as yet a choice between involvement and detachment. It is the analogy of visual terms of the impersonality characteristic of scientific language. And the perspective used in drawing 3 of figure 4.21 is called angular isometric perspective. Here, the front is distorted. The square is no longer represented as a square, but the horizontal and vertical parallels do not converge. There is no end to space in this kind of perspective. It stretches on indefinitely. Angular isometric perspective was used, for example, in 18th century, like Japanese woodcuts or Japanese artists of this period always choose an oblique point of view as well as relatively high angle. They looked at the world without a sense of involvement. So we can see that they take a look at the world from a detached point of view, from a meditative distance. And we also have the figure number 4. It is the cube that is seen from an angle in central perspective. In the angle of central perspective in the figure number 4, if the angle is high, we can look down on the cube. The top will also come into view, but in this case, the front will no longer be square. It will be distorted. Next slide, we have this inverted perspective was something used in medieval art. This allows both sides of an objective to be seen and cause the perspectival factors to diverge rather than converge. It can often be found in the children's drawing, and in recent times has been taken up by painters such as Picasso and Braque, who looked for a more objective way of representing the world, regarding the simple viewpoint of central perspective as one-sided and restrictive, and viewing reality as multifaceted, a complex whole of often incompatible and mutually clashing viewpoint. Next slide, we come to the slide where it is the conclusion. We can conclude that such angles do suggest viewer positions, but spatial and privileged one, which neutralize the distortion that usually come with perspective because they neutralize perspective itself. We also have the key terms in this chapter, which is involvement, detachment, viewer power, equality, and that relates to frontal angle, oblique angle, high angle, and eye level angle, as well as low angle. So, based on the key term about our discussion, when image has a frontal angle, we will look at it with a sense of involvement. Meanwhile, in a visual perspective that has an oblique angle, it has a sense of detachment, and etc. When the angle is high, it is indicated of viewer power, and when it has the A level angle, it is representing the equality, but when it has the low angle, it represented the participant power. So, when it comes to the interactive meaning, particularly on our attitudes as a viewer, it can be classified into subjectively and objectively. Subjectively is related to involvement, detachment, viewer power, and representation power. Meanwhile, when it comes to objectivity, it is related to the action orientation and knowledge orientation. And that's it, guys, for what I can explain to you. I hope you understand it well, and I'm really sorry if there is some mistakes and quite complicated terms. I'm really sorry, but I try my best for this presentation. Thank you so much. And this is the slide for the references based on Gunter Crush book, Reading Images, the Grammar of Visual. Thank you so much.